So for a lot of people in India who might know or might not know about the work that you do, who is Joseph Cox? So I'm going to put the onus of describing and all the products that you want to add over to you.
Sure, that makes sense. So I'm Joseph Cox. I'm an investigative journalist who focuses on hackers, privacy, surveillance, technology more broadly as well, and that can include artificial intelligence and all sorts of things around that. I was for years at Motherboard, which was the technology section of Vice Media. You may be familiar with Vice News and that sort of thing. There was a tech site, and I was one of the writers there for a very long time. Then Vice had a lot of financial difficulties, not because of the journalists, but because of the executives at the top of the company. So we decided to go out on our own and make 404 Media, and that is a subscriber-powered investigations outlet where we can do all of the sorts of investigations that we care about, that we think people should know about, but we also control the business. So we can decide, well, let's put money into sending me, like last week, to Las Vegas to go to a hacking conference, that sort of thing. We can make those decisions. And then beyond 404 Media, I'm also the author of Dark Wire, the largest sting operation ever. And that is the very crazy inside story of how the FBI secretly ran its own tech startup, essentially, and encrypted messaging app for organized criminals to wiretap the world.
Thank you so much for doing that. And your work has had real impact. You've won awards for the work that you've done. So congratulations on that. You also have a very nice bookcase behind you, but you're not plugging your book very well.
Well, it's right. Yeah, it's just behind my head. There you go.
Yeah,
I need to work on the positioning. Yeah.
So Darkfire is an incredible book, and we're going to get to the book. But you have some amazing books like Black Edge. I think over there is one of my favorite financial investigative pieces of all times, and others I can't see, but I'm pretty sure they would be good. So we're here to talk about Darkwire, and because you did do that segue to the conference last week, you also made a presentation in that conference. You just didn't go and cover the conference. You made a presentation in that conference. We also write about that in 404 Media, and it's only for subscribers. So people who are interested in privacy and people who want to know more about technology, I would say that they should subscribe. In fact, I'm going to subscribe later in the day or tomorrow morning, as the case may be, because I've just been going through the website. So kudos on that. We're going to jump into Darkwire, and we've covered, in fact, you appeared on a podcast in association with Brookings and a bunch of other people and organizations in the United States. Their interest has been from the United States point of view. We are a think tank in India. We are called ASIA, Advanced Study Institute of Asia. So there are three large strands that I want to pick up during this conversation. And so if you think I'm getting sidetracked or if you don't really want to talk about it, please feel free to let me know. One, about the ethics of it all, because you kind of struggle in the book, even when you write about it. Second, the Havala network. In fact, you have a chapter on Havala, and Havala network is something that we in South Asia have really, really been exposed to. And unfortunately, it's something that stems from our culture. And the third thing is, 1,000 people arrested, great start to a tech startup, same architect that designed Dropbox headquarters, where this startup ran from. But next, what is next? How do we take it up from there? But before we get into all of this, this is not the first time that a law enforcement organization in the United States did a massive surveillance exercise. And so before we get into specifics of what your book covers, would you like to take us through a little bit about sort of a history lesson? What happens in this surveillance sort of history of surveillance operations which end up netting criminal or non-state actors.
Yeah, you're completely right. And the US absolutely does have a history of doing surveillance far beyond its borders. I mean, I'm sure everybody knows the general contours of this, but of course, the catalyzing moment for everybody understanding this was the Edward Snowden revelations in 2013. I remember learning about that myself. And of course, as an English person, it also touched on GCHQ, our signals intelligence agency as well, and learned all of these very, very crazy things about how they were tapping undersea cables, all of that sort of thing. The biggest revelation, at least in the US, was that the government had entered these secret agreements with telcos to monitor all domestic medical metadata, call data inside the country. The NSA is not supposed to be doing that. It was found to be illegal, all of that sort of thing. But as it relates to Anom, the US is especially important because it goes worldwide, right? And we'll talk about how the Anom app does that specifically. But one case I can think of is that a few years after the Edward Snowden revelations, there was an operation called Operation Pacifier. Very unfortunate name. The FBI has a habit of doing this because this was actually about a child abuse website. And what the FBI did was that they took over this website on the dark web, and then they deployed malware from it. So hacking tools that anybody who would visit that website would then get hacked by the FBI automatically, and it would get information about their computer that led to a bunch of arrests. Now, you may say that all sounds well and good. I would agree. I think it's a very good thing to arrest child abusers. That goes without saying, but I'm gonna say it anyway. But it brings up a key question, which is like, well, what legal authority did the Americans have to go hack people basically wherever they wanted in South America, in Asia, in Southeast Asia, in Russia as well? I think there was some even in China, across Europe, all across the world. What gives them the authority to do that? And at least when it comes to a legal idea, that was actually battled in court, where some defense attorneys and some higher judges found that the judge who authorized that hacking operation didn't have the authority to do so. But even if you're debating the ins and outs of the legality or the illegality, American law enforcement do see themselves as as able to do this, like ethically as such. There is, of course, the very tongue-in-cheek and over-the-top film Team America. I would not take that seriously. Obviously, I'm bringing it up as a caricature, but the prosecutors I speak to in the Anom case that we'll get to, they do see themselves as that. They say, well, if we can do it, why don't we go out and do it? And I think that is the constant thread throughout a lot of US surveillance that people may not necessarily understand when they've only read the Edward Snowden documents or the coverage around that, or they read coverage of a case like Pacifier. I've gone and spoken to some of the prosecutors and the FBI agents who work on the case. And when you ask them, well, why did you enter into other countries, albeit digitally? They're like, why not? And I don't think every country would necessarily do that. I don't think it's exclusively an American thing, but even if you step back and you divorce it from the American side a little bit, this is what law enforcement is today. Law enforcement is a global enterprise. No longer is it just, oh, this country has a law enforcement agency and investigates within its own borders. Multiple countries are doing this in Europe as well. And I think that's in response to crime being more globalized and more distributed as well. But it's a really interesting development with lots of consequences for surveillance, privacy, law enforcement, drug trafficking, child abuse, whatever it may be.
Thank you. That's fascinating. CIA also has but CIA technically is that gray area between law enforcement and law breaking. So we can't really get into that. But they also kind of pile up on these surveillance and extra surveillance mechanism. Now, coming to the book.
Yeah.
Fascinating book. I bought this book on Audible, and I've heard the book twice now, and I find it extremely well written, and I mean, it shows the amount of time that we spent. But interestingly, from a reader's point of view, the first part of the book is not about the app. It's kind of a build up to the app. And I think there's a very interesting story there. The story is about encryption technology. So tell us about that first failed operation that FBI wanted to get into an encryption app, and then the owner of that particular company, which was reliant on BlackBerry, decides to flee off to Canada. So not FBI's finest moment, but I think that's a very interesting pivot from which we kind of get into this world.
Yeah, I mean, it was very embarrassing for the FBI, and I'll get to the specifics. But broadly, there is an industry, I call it like a shadow industry, of these underground encrypted phone companies. Now, these are not your Signals, your Freemers, your Telegrams, your WhatsApp. They're all public facing, mostly legitimate apps that we all use every single day as a journalist, a human rights defender, an activist, an academic, whatever, right? Underneath those, there are these companies that may have started legitimately and then catered to criminals, or in some cases, they were just straight up started by organized criminals, and they are in this shadow industry. And they will take handsets from BlackBerry, as you said, but now more recently, it's much more Android phones or Apple iPhones. They will take those and they will load them with custom software. Most importantly, that's an end-to-end encrypted messaging app where if you're on an app made by the company called Phantom, which I'll go into in a little bit in a minute, Phantom Secure, you can only talk to other Phantom Secure users. It's not like a normal SMS that can go between AT&T and T-Mobile and O2 or whatever. You can only talk internally on that network. It also allows you to, if the phone lands in the hands of law enforcement, you contact Phantom Secure and say, hey, the cops got my phone. Could you wipe the data from the device? And they will do that even knowing full well that they've just been told that there's evidence of a crime on there. Very different to Apple, because if you're an Apple user, you do that wipe yourself, right? You log into iCloud and do it. This is much more of a collaboration between the end user and the company, right? So you have that. And then sometimes the companies will even remove the microphone, the GPS, the camera. So it's actually not really much of a phone at all. It's sort of like a restricted computer in your pocket. And these companies sell those products for hundreds, if not thousands of dollars for a 6-month, 8-month, 12-month subscription. Very, very lucrative. And that's why there's a handful, half a dozen or so of these companies in this space. The one the book starts with, Phantom Secure, started in Vancouver, based on BlackBerry handsets, as you said. There's a thing about Vancouver and Canada with some of these companies, and even people I've spoken to who run those companies in Canada don't really know why it all started there. I've asked like at least 2 or 3 of them, and they don't really get it. They're like, oh, I don't know, it's pro-privacy or something. So leave that aside. But Phantom Secure becomes very popular, especially with violent biker gangs in Australia, to the point where Australian authorities go on TV and say, these encrypted phones are making our job really, really difficult. That ironically makes Phantom Secure more popular in the country because the criminals see that and they're like, damn, I have to get that phone. And then they're also used by the Sinaloa drug cartel, of course, in Mexico and elsewhere through Central and South America. So the FBI, initially after investigating one prolific user of Phantom Secure, pivots and says, what if we investigate the company itself? And the US is only able to do this because it has RICO, where the racketeering, influenced, corrupt organization. I probably got that wrong, but
RICO Act.
Yes, RICO Act. I'm just going to leave it as that. I'm not even going to spell it out. But they have that, and that's a very novel legal concept, because it was used to go after mob bosses, right? Like, you don't really have any evidence that the mob boss, the guy in the mafia, really killed anybody. But if you can prove there's an overall criminal entity, you can charge that. So they apply that to the phone companies. And then after that, so they start investigating Phantom Secure, and the owner, the CEO, Vincent Ramos, they lure him to a Vegas hotel room. In part because, they're probably going to arrest him, but they actually want to do something else first, which is they ask for a back door into Phantom Secure, some sort of way to read all of the currently encrypted messages of these users. There's something between 7 and 10,000 users of Phantom Secure. The FBI is imagining, what would it be like to be able to read all of the chats of those sorts of users? When they've got hold of Phantom Secure devices before, the content has been overwhelmingly criminal in nature, like people not even using code words, just straight up talking about moving massive shipments of cocaine. So what if the FBI could get access to that? For various reasons, they don't. Vincent Ramos isn't really technically capable of doing that. His CTO is over in Canada. He sort of flip-flops, doesn't really commit. And then he goes on the run, and there's this rarely dramatic scene or series of scenes in the book where the FBI have to deploy all of these resources, US Marshals, local sheriffs, local police departments, and track this guy down. They do get him. But it does plant the seed of this idea still, which is like, okay, it didn't work here and we failed to get the back door, but still, what would that back door be like?
So there is a very interesting telling moment in the book because he's essentially the first person to be charged where they're going after an encrypted company. I think there was only one instance that you talk about in the book, but that was related to one drug crime.
Right.
But the argument of FBI was that this entire operation itself is an enabler of crime, and therefore it must be treated as a criminal organization. So that is placed on record, because every judgment in of that nature is a matter of public record. And then when we get into the second part, so one of the figures from Australia, the biker gangs, or the bikie gangs as they are known in Australia, that guy is mulling over the idea of starting something as a startup, something that can bring him laurels in the criminal world. And he comes over to the FBI. And the FBI latches onto this idea and says, hey, this is our golden opportunity. Is there anything in your reporting that kind of points to the fact that there were moments in FBI? I'm not talking about, because your book makes it very clear that DOJ is worried about it. The attorney's office is very worried about it. But FBI seems very convinced that this is the path that we have to take. Was there any hesitation at all on FBI's part?
Not from the FBI side, which is what I've been told. FBI was behind the idea of running an encrypted phone company basically immediately. What the way it's been described to me is that they didn't, the higher ups of the FBI in San Diego did not need much convincing about how exciting this idea was, the utility of it, how unprecedented it would be, and they barreled ahead. The thing that got in the way for starting the operation, and then some roadblocks along the way as well, was, as you say, the lawyers, basically, not just inside the US Attorney's office in San Diego, where I've been. It's not a very nice office. They'll be fine with me saying that. They told me as much. And then more senior lawyers in DC as well, they had massive issues with it. But when it came to the FBI, no, they wanted to run with it.
So this is the bit that I really want to understand, because in the book, it's very clear that this is coming from one part of FBI, which is based in California. So they are exposed to the technology world. Was it because they see cases directly linked to technology companies that they understand the power of technology? Because imagine for a moment if the MSS, the Ministry of State Security in China, were to suddenly act on these impulses and start a company that targets criminals in the United States. I'm not sure that Department of State would take a very kindly, friendly view to that. So the contradiction of this is something that I want to understand, because this is all happening during the for lack of a better word, a libertarian president, Mr. Trump of the Republican Party, with Peter Thiel as one of the backers, is in the White House. Was it a technology blind spot that the FBI itself kind of forget to build a guardrail against? Is there anything that, I mean, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah. I think on the first bit, on technology, California, San Diego, that sort of thing, I think that's potentially possible. I think it's more that the individuals involved in this, especially the main prosecutor called Andrew Young, he wasn't a drug prosecutor. He came from like
The
white collar.
finance.
Yes, he came from like white collar crime, tax, and that sort of thing. So he gets handed basically this case, or sort of falls into his and the FBI's lap, and they run with it. But he isn't bogged down with the normal ideas of running a drug case in America, which is like, well, let's just go arrest sort of the underprivileged people who are looked over in society, give them a very boilerplate written plea deal, and then we'll just move on. They thought they were doing something different. And you brought up it happened during the Trump presidency as well. Usually that wouldn't be super relevant because, ideally the FBI is separate from the executive branch in an ideal world. But the person who approved it in San Diego, Attorney General Bob Brewer, he was specifically a Trump political appointee. And he's quite
26
old.
years, 26 years. First time in 26 years, there was a lateral entry into this particular thing. Sorry, just
No, you're totally right. And it's crucial that he was an outsider for a quarter of a century, because he then comes in as a Trump political appointee and he's like, this is a great idea. Let's go with it. And I don't think a more established sort of career bureaucrat or career lawyer would have actually approved that. Yeah. And then you had a second part of your question that I can't quite remember now.
So my second part was just a theoretical sort of thought experiment, really, building on the first question that you also referred to. So MSS is a if you actually, so I'm an economist, but my area of expertise is China. So you see MSS putting out different stories to protect data, to kind of safeguard data, and stay vigilant about it. So this is not a very hard experiment to run. I mean, it does not really take a lot to build an app. And I'm pretty sure that MSS is very capable of doing that as well. But I don't think the Americans are going to like it. Forget about MSS. If GCHQ were to do it, I'm not sure the special partnership is really going to, withstand that either. So I was just wondering about the fact that it's a very interesting liminal zone, but we don't really see any of the characters because you have interviewed them, but nobody raises a moment of doubt about it. So I just thought I'm going to flag it and get your perspective on it.
Yeah, and I totally agree that if the Chinese government did something similar and and those phones or that app or whatever landed in the US and had US users, I don't think the US government would really appreciate that at all, especially if it landed in the hands of civilians, and Anom, which is the app and the company the FBI secretly ran, it did land in the hands of civilians, but rarely did so. It was primarily geared towards criminals and drug traffickers, that sort of thing. Even if China, or I think even another adversarial government like Russia or whoever, if they did something similar and still it was targeted towards drug traffickers and it still landed in the US, I don't think the US is going to like that. And yes, that may come across as hypocritical, but I don't think it ultimately matters because the US is a superpower and it's going to do it anyway. I don't think if you go to the FBI and go, but now you're being a hit, I don't think they're going to care. Exactly.
True.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But you've done a good job of flagging it, and I thought that I'm going to bring it up.
Sure.
So now we get to the meat and potato of this story, which is the app. So tell us a bit about the people who made the app, because we are going to get to the users, but the people who made the app, you have some very graphical description of somebody in Bangalore who's a product manager. You get coders hired from all over the world. You have a nondescript building in Hong Kong. Tell us about the logistics of this entire operation.
Yeah, sure. So at the top, you have somebody called AFGO, AFGOO, and they are the creator of Anom, and they're the person who approached the FBI and says, hey, I'll give you this embryonic app and company I'm making in exchange for payment. And a lesser sentence for any charges I may or may not face in the future. And what AFGU did was hire
$180,000 for the listeners who have not read the book. $120,000 plus $60,000. Sorry, just a comment.
Yeah, and I don't know. That seems quite cheap for the FBI anyway, which is
very cheap.
They got a deal.
That's what I thought.
A very well-funded agency paying $180K to wiretap the world. I don't know. They got a bargain. But AFGU then obviously has to actually make the app. My understanding is that they're not really super technical, and you can't just do an app on one person, really, at least to any sort of scale. So they hire a bunch of normal Android developers underneath him. And to be clear, these people don't know they're working on a surveillance tool. They don't know they are, like, in effect working for the FBI, even if the FBI is a couple hops removed. They go to freelancing sites like Fiverr or Angel.co, and they're just signing up for a normal Android developer job. And it's like, hey, we're making an encrypted messaging app. Would you like to be involved? And, I spoke to some of those people. As you said, the project manager was in Bangalore. I think they were actually working on a co-working space to get some of the devs together in person. I think COVID disrupted those plans and some other disruptions as well. But they were entirely ordinary people. One of the people who I speak to, and I gave him a fake name in the book just to protect his identity, but he's laying on bed in his house and then just programming on his MacBook, laying on his chest, like a lot of people working from home probably do. And they just go about their day as any other sort of dev would as well. And they get paid, I don't know, $1,000 a month, which isn't that great for the amount of work they were actually performing. So you have those people. They're sort of the Android devs making the Anom app. Then there's almost not quite a secret team, but a separated team, also under AFGU, but compartmentalized from the app people. And they are working on something called Arcane OS. And this is the highly customized, secure operating system that runs on the Anom phones that the FBI is secretly running. And that does all sorts of other things. It introduces all of these security features, at least to the users, where it says, oh, look, we've turned off GPS functionality. We've made the kernel more secure, so it's less likely to get hacked. In reality, the FBI is actually introducing features every time that benefit the agency as well. So instead of there being no GPS code, the phone's actually recording the GPS coordinates whenever somebody sends a message. And then all sorts of other things, such as when somebody takes a photo on the app and they redact the image, a sort of a face blur feature, the FBI just gets the original copy. They get the original copy of voice memos. Any documents stored in the secure vault of the phone get transferred to the FBI as well. I mean, it's a big development effort. As well as those two teams, you have them running on AWS infrastructure, Google Cloud infrastructure. It is a fully fledged tech company. Just from the outside, it looked like a sketchy, potentially criminal tech company, but actually it was the FBI all along.
It was a pretty large company as well. I mean, thousands of users spread throughout the world. So it was not really a simple wiretap, because the logic that the FBI uses to get it approved is that this is just like a wiretap. But as a technology journalist and as an avowed privacy enthusiast, I think I read your Wired piece about using an iPod Nano for calling device, as a phone. And now, if I'm not wrong, you said in an interview that you use an iPad mini, if I'm not wrong. You still don't have a cell phone.
Here it is.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's very large. I have to wear jackets that have big enough pockets to carry my iPad mini around. Yeah, because I don't trust cellular networks. And it's a very extreme position, but it's the one I chose.
So you are sort of somebody who respects your own privacy, and perhaps you don't want large big tech companies to kind of snoop in, right, for lack of a better word. But tell us a little bit about how FBI got this, because it was not a very simple process. I think a country in the European Union was the place that all of this was running, the server farm was running from that. And the FBI got documents dispatched on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, if I'm not wrong. So tell us a bit about what about the non-criminal users? I mean, because in the book you have this extract. So you are a criminal, you're a person employed in a criminal organization, and then you have a significant other, or you would want to see somebody, and then you give them a phone. So FBI would consider them possible targets as well. Run me through this contradiction, because it's not a simple wiretap at that point of time. It is open surveillance.
Yes. Yeah. So in the FBI's eyes, because the FBI, again in its eyes, is marketing this just to criminals, the people selling the phones are either close to criminals or sometimes drug traffickers themselves. Sometimes you need a password to get into the Anom website from one of these resellers. The FBI thinks they're running something of a closed network that's, only for criminals. So in their eyes, if you're on Anom, you are a valid target. That gets more complicated when, as you say, there's an instance in the book where somebody buys an Anom phone for themselves. They get on the platform, but then they also buy phones for their various girlfriends, right? Just presumably because they want to communicate securely on there for whatever reason. The FBI believes those people are also valid targets because of who they're associated with. They're not suspected of a crime yet. They haven't committed a crime yet, but because of who they're affiliated with, the FBI sees them as a ripe target because, well, maybe the girlfriend gets told about where some drugs are or something like that. And you may think then, well, wait, legally, how can they do that? You need probable cause or a search warrant or a wiretap order or some sort of legal mechanism to monitor these people. But the fact is that you mentioned that European country, Lithuania, that processed the messages. All of the data from Anom was given to the FBI under a mutual legal assistance treaty, which meant it kind of basically came with no strings attached. It's like, here's the data, go crazy. So legally, they didn't have to restrict themselves to just the very clear criminals.
Right. The reason I asked that question about the legal and technological limitations on that, because in the wiretapping, there is a duty of care. And the duty of care or the duty of justice is that if you hear about a particular crime, then you're going to try and either avert the crime or save people involved in it. But there are instances after instances in the book that you have documented where. So I think the one that really sticks in my mind is about one of these. There was a philanderer who was on this Anom network, and then his girlfriend had a fight with a friend of hers, and she wants to firebomb this friend's barbershop, if I'm not wrong. Mm-hmm. and he does it. And FBI knew about it, and I think it passed on the information, but really this was not something that they averted. And then there's the Swedish police officer that you talk about in the book, who pretends that an intelligence has come in from a real person. It does not appear that they actually tried averting. They kept on asking, looking at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
So technically, when all of this came out, and I tried looking very hard while I was, listening to the book, was there an outcry from privacy organization, advocacy groups? And I couldn't find anything. Could you shed some light on that?
Well, that is a massive reason why I wrote the book. So I've been covering the encrypted phone industry since at least 2016, and I've seen these operations escalate from shutting down companies to them being hacked. There was a case of another company called EncroChat that the French military police hacked, and they hacked all of those users indiscriminately with very powerful malware. A lot of those people were criminals, but some of them were lawyers as well who hadn't committed the crime. They were just a defense lawyer, and regardless of the crime, everybody deserves legal representation, whatever it is, to make sure charges are correct and all that, blah, blah, blah. So you have that. And then after that, we find out that the FBI was running Anom. So I've seen these operations escalate and escalate. And you just don't have the normal people you expect in the privacy world having an issue with this. And that's fine. I'm not an activist. I'm a journalist. It's not my job to say, oh, you have to care about this issue, you have to care about that issue. And I think there are two reasons for it. The first is that the investigations were primarily against criminals, and that sort of muddies the water a little bit. It sort of makes it a hard issue for people to necessarily easily go, oh, that's something I should be concerned about. Well, no, it applies to drug traffickers. Who cares? And I don't think that's correct, to be clear, but I can see why people would think that. The second is that these operations were done in so much secrecy that we don't actually know basically what happened. We all learned about Anom in June 2021 when the US Attorney's Office in San Diego held their press conference. Europol did one and the Australians did one as well. That was the big day where the cops came forward and they said we ran Anom. But beyond those press conferences, there was basically no information. And that's why I went back and I spoke to all my sources who sell these phones, my drug trafficking sources, later the FBI, the people who coded the phones, to figure out what actually happened when the FBI did get a backdoor into an electronic communications product. And, this book is the product of that. And now we know why. But I think it's going to be a little while before maybe privacy advocates or policymakers or academics digest this. Because, the book only came out in June. to be fair, I'm not expecting everybody to have read it already. But what I really hope now is that people who are a lot smarter than me and people in different positions, like academics or activists or whoever, can read this and digest and think about, do we want the police to be doing this? Is this proper? Is this good? Is it bad? Whatever. But to answer your question, it's because it was so opaque that I'd spent years investigating this book. From the moment and really before Anon was announced, I've been working on it nonstop. And now I just hope that we can have that conversation, and there can be more of those conversations from privacy people if they wish to do so, but it's because we didn't know, basically.
Right. And that's the thing that really jumps at me, because, the book builds up as a crescendo and you can see where it is headed, because it's not really a secret. We all know that, one fine day we were told in the middle of COVID pandemic that, hey, we've arrested 1,000 people and we $45 million worth in this, that, and, we have got cars and drugs to prove that this thing works. But my question is, and again, I'm going to kind of link it back to Asia, because so you have totalitarian governments. You could say that China is a classic example of a proto-authoritarian government, if not a fully authoritarian government. You have Russia. You have states like Singapore that appear to be democratic on the outside, but inside they can be quasi-undemocratic. The entire argument of the Western world has been, from the times of Magna Carta in 1215 all the way to 2024, there is respect for dignity and privacy. Privacy for everybody. But privacy for crime and criminals is out, okay. But who gets designated as a criminal is a very opaque definition, because it's essentially the strategy folks at FBI who decide that, because the example from EncroChat, the lawyer that you talk about, it's a very good example. Before we get into all of this, I think you talked about how you stumbled upon Anom. I think that's the story that's not in the book. So would you like to tell us a little bit about it? Because you heard about Anom right at the time that FBI was building this secret startup.
Yeah. So there had been a little bit of media coverage in the Australian press about this hot app called Anom that criminals were using. And of course, I'm following it because I'm following the industry and all of that. And I cover the encrypted phone industry in the same way somebody might cover Silicon Valley or Facebook or whatever, like get sources, cover developments, all of that sort of thing. So I hear inklings, but I only actually realize that the FBI is running Anom the same moment as everybody else, June 7th, 2021, when they come forward and they announce it. I get an email the day before from US DOJ saying, oh, we have a press conference tomorrow about encrypted communications. I'm like, well, obviously I'm going to tune into that. That sounds pretty interesting. I was not expecting them to reveal that they had secretly been running a tech startup for years for organized crime. And then that's when I went back and I started pinging some of my sources who sold phones. And I asked them, hey, like, did you know about this Anom thing? And they said, yes, I was selling it. They just didn't tell me because they thought they had a really good hustle going on. They had a really, really good business. The phones were selling, they were making money. Of course, they didn't realize they were walking straight into the FBI's trap. And that's when I went back in time. And I also started speaking to Andrew Young a lot more. Like, now it was public, he could talk about it. But I had all of the sources in place. It's just that for various reasons, none of them brought up Anom until it became public. And then I could go back and start figuring it all out. And of course, get many, many, many more sources after that as well.
Right. So when we, in the story of Anom, one of the most important, important. So FBI is the star of the show, but there is also a great supporting cast. You have the entirety of Europol. You have non-Europe member organizations also party to it. Tell us a little bit about the other operation that was going on. I think you referred about the DGSE and the gendarmes running operations to shut down encrypted and other things. But that's also a story in its own right. And if I read it correctly, it was to open a larger market share for Anom. So was it done at the behest or the request of the FBI, or was it their own initiative?
So when Andrew Young, the main US prosecutor, is trying to figure out how legally to do this, he starts going to Europe and asking countries there, hey, could you host this server for us? For various legal reasons that I'm probably not qualified to get into, and if we have time, the US didn't think they could host a server in America, basically, because of various laws. So that's why they were finding people in Europe to host it. And eventually they settled on Lithuania, that sort of thing. During those meetings, Andrew Young and the FBI learned that the Europeans are running their own operations in parallel. First to hack into EncroChat, the one I already mentioned, and they're also going to hack into another encrypted phone company called Sky, which is like the 800-pound gorilla, the juggernaut of the encrypted phone industry. They are the big, big, big players. So, if the Europeans can hack into those, that would be amazing. They'll have a ton of different messages. But then in those conversations between these two initially parallel strands of investigations, a sort of master plan emerges, which is that, well, if you hack EncroChat and it shuts down, people will probably move to Anom because they still need a phone, they still need to traffic drugs. And especially if you hack Sky, people will leave that and go to Anom as well. Of course, Sky users are already being monitored because they're going to get hacked. But then if they move to Anom, we can keep monitoring them as well. Most importantly, the FBI was also investigating Sky, but they were going to do what they did with Phantom, which is like, well, we'll just indict the CEO and we'll arrest him if we can and shut down the company. So there was absolutely this deliberate double punch of let's hack Sky, let's indict the owner of Sky. That will increase market, maybe not share, but like opportunity for Anom, and then more criminals will move over to Anom as well. And that was always sort of the suspicion or the inkling when we all learned about Anom from the outside, like, oh, that's funny coincidental timing. I was honestly shocked when I spoke to the US authorities, and especially the Dutch authorities who I speak to in there, who are part of some of these hacks, and they straight up admitted, yeah, we shut down this one company to drive people to the FBI's secret one. I was kind of taken aback by that, to be honest.
Right. It is a pretty surprising thing. The two questions that kind of pop up when you talk about the RCMP investigation into the first, the first part of the book. So there is a person who's unnamed in the book and who shall remain nameless here as well, who gets, I think he's later on, he gets found out and is currently serving some time. There was no leak in this huge operation. So that, I think, is one of the most remarkable things about it. What does that tell you about this international cooperation of crime investigation? Do you think because it was so focused on one particular very nasty set of criminals, the drug movers, that it could happen, or did COVID really help? So
yeah, that's a good
no
point.
leakage at all.
Yeah, so I think two things. So first, when the Europeans hacked into Sky, details of that did leak at least a few days before, where I've gone through messages I've obtained. Like I've gone through the hacked Sky messages, at least some of them, and I've read that people were talking about, hey, Sky is compromised. They've got this method. They were talking very specifics. Like it was clear the operation had leaked somehow, and some people then dropped Sky and they moved on to other providers. Not ideal for the police, still a massive operation, still a success. As you say, Anom never really leaked. People got suspicious towards the end because there was so much law enforcement activity, but there was never a clear, this country leaked it and exposed Anom. The reason I think that is in part because the Americans, yes, they eventually shared it with 16 other countries as part of this Europol operational task force, as you said, but they were still pretty selective. They did not give information about Anom to countries like the Balkans and sort of that part of the world, because frankly, they understood there's a lot of public corruption there, and they only gave information about Anom and what happened once it was already public. I spoke to the FBI agents who, after the Anom sort of reveal in June 2021, days later, they were on planes over to that part of the world to share intelligence, because it's still important, it's still actionable, but they didn't want to do it beforehand. And then to more directly answer your question about sort of collaboration, I think after EncroChat, after Sky, and then coming to Anom, law enforcement saw just how powerful these capabilities were, and they would really be shooting themselves in the foot if they didn't play game and they sort of didn't go along and they leaked it. That and the lack of sharing with countries that the FBI didn't trust. There's sort of a tension because with the EncroChat case, at least the way it was described to me, the French military police had all of this intelligence, but they were quite slow at sharing it. Like there was a bottleneck. I think one FBI agent I spoke to said it was like one guy delivering all of the Amazon packages or something. With Anom, the FBI gave direct remote access to a ton of different countries. Like here's a login, go in, start digging into it. So there is a bit of a tension there. Like, oh, on one hand, they're giving them a lot of access, but it didn't leak. I think they shared it with the right countries, at least in their eyes, basically. And COVID, potentially. I mean, COVID disrupted everything. It disrupted this operation. It disrupted the drug traffickers as well. I wouldn't be surprised if it sort of slowed down any leaks potentially as well.
Right. The other thing that really pops up, because as an economist, we love to place a value on everything. How much did all of this cost the different law enforcement organizations? I mean, you're running a startup. I'm presuming they were not on a startup credit program of AWS.
No, I don't think so. That is actually the one question the FBI would not answer for me. And I've had multiple conversations with the FBI. I've asked them directly lots of stuff many, many different times. And when I said, like, how much did this cost? They wouldn't answer it. What I do know is that running one of these companies is very, very expensive. You have all of that infrastructure. You also especially have the unlimited data eSIMs, which go into the phone or the phones are signed up to, because these phones are designed to work in basically any country. You fly over to Thailand, or then you go to Malaysia, and then maybe you go back to Europe. The phones have to work all the time because, obviously these drug traffickers are in a legal business, but they're in a highly efficient, highly profitable, highly international business. And those things are very, very expensive. And then the last thing I'll say on the money is that when the money trickled back up the pyramid from the end users of Anom to the resellers, to the distributors, to AFCU, then the FBI reinvested that money back into the company. I don't know how much exactly, but they did reinvest it, which is, that's just good business.
Yeah, great business. So that then brings us to all the sort of the network, the people who really benefited. There are two people who stand out from the Australian biking community. And both of them, incidentally, are Turkish. So they play an outsized role in getting these encrypted apps in the hands of all of these criminals. What really was happening in terms of trust and credibility from these devices? Because did they ever get an IT expert to actually take a look under the hood? Because it just feels very. I mean, this one person who has this outstretched influence on which messaging app you're going to be doing your business on, and that becomes very clear in the book. But did they ever really take it to like a forensic IT expert?
Yeah, I think some people did forensically analyze the phones, that I was told, and I've seen evidence of that in the messages. But the network was set up in the Anom network was set up in such a way. There were proxy servers. There was like, so you have the normal chat server that would go to a proxy, and then that would then go to the collection server in Lithuania. So there was some masking. Even if you had a phone and you were intercepting all of the traffic, you may not see where it's ultimately ending up. And that's sort of a normal security practice, but I think it would have hampered those efforts. And you bring up trust when it comes to these phones, and I think that is a really interesting part of this entire industry, because these drug traffickers, they don't trust Apple, they don't trust Google. They just assume that, oh, they're big American companies, they're going to work with the FBI. Even though in San Bernardino, the terrorist attack in America, we saw Apple refuse to provide access to the device, various technical and legal and ethical reasons. The FBI found a way to hack it through a company called Azimuth Security anyway. Even then, these drug traffickers, like, we're not going to trust Apple. So they turn to these underground providers. And not only do they trust them because they think, oh, this is a small company that's closer to our interests, it also gives them someone to target. If Apple gave up a drug trafficker's data, they're not going to go and assassinate Tim Cook. Oh, well, I mean, that would be very, very crazy and very, very stupid to try to do that. But if there's a smaller provider that's selling like these encrypted phones, and oh, I bought your phone and then my drug lab got raided, they could go and harm the reseller who sold them the phone. They could even go a step or two above and try to harm the people who are running the company as well. So there's sort of a direct interface there. And then the last thing about trust is that you mentioned these two people, very important. I think you're referring first to Hakan Ayik, who's, I can go into more detail in a bit, and the other is a guy called Maximilian Rifkin, Microsoft, both now Turkish. And that enters into the discussion of trust, because Hakan still is one of the most infamous drug traffickers in the world if you follow this industry. And what better endorsement of your product, of Anom, do you have than having a multi-billion-dollar drug trafficker actively using and selling it? And then, oh, he's on it? I'm going to trust this platform.
Right. So that kind of, before we get into the Havala network and the other related issue, why not trust Signal? I mean, Signal was not really going to be releasing up, because this is something I've not been able to wrap my head around. Not-for-profit company runs this massively. I'm presuming that Signal, they didn't have to press a specific key on calculator to get to Signal. So was the Anom app doing something that was massively better than Signal, or was it just a distrust of large tech?
Yeah. So the Anom app and the Anom devices do provide some things that Signal by itself out of the box is not going to, like the wipe feature. I mentioned that sort of thing. And to be fair, some criminals do use Signal. I was reading through some court documents just earlier this week or last week, and one person used Sky. They used FaceTime and iMessage, which is, okay, that's just the default iPhone apps, so kind of here and all there. But then they use Signal as well. And sort of the question comes up was like, well, why don't they do all their crimes on Signal rather than some on Signal and then, well, presumably, because they don't actually have access to the Signal messages to the police, so we don't know. Presumably some on Signal, then some on Sky. It's because of this network effect that these encrypted apps use. Like, if your drug provider in Colombia or Ecuador or wherever is on Sky or is on Anom, you have to be on Sky and Anom as well, because these devices are not interoperable. You have to buy into that network as well. So if somebody pretty high up, like Hakanik with Anom, and you want to work with him, is on Anom, you have to do that as well. Now, of course, maybe it would be better if the guy at the top just used Signal. But I also think these people like these closed networks because they think it's harder to get in touch with them. If Hakanik is just on Signal, which I believe he also is, you just get his phone number and you can message him. He'd be like, well, who the hell is this? I'm a very busy drug trafficker. I don't want to talk to this person. They see it as a closed network and they like that.
Right. So it's the network effect.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about, because I think the drug network was busted, but the Havala network, from what I've been able to gather, continues unabated, because they've not really been able to interrupt that at all in any way, shape, or form. But Havala did play a very important role in shaping up the usability and usefulness of the app. So,
So Havala is, for those who don't know, it's basically an underground banking system, right? Where you have these people who are outside of traditional banks with credit accounts, saving accounts, debit cards, all of that sort of thing. And this person will act as your sort of personal banker, ATM, and sometimes a Bitcoin cryptocurrency exchange as well. And you will contact them and say, hey, I want to deposit $10,000 into my account. They will then send somebody over to pick up the 10,000, put it into their safe house, kind of the equivalent of their bank vault, and they'll update your account, which is a spreadsheet on their phone, basically. And then if you say, okay, now my guys in Colombia want that $10,000, they'll then withdraw it from another safe house there. So it acts just like a bank, but there's no wire transfers, there's no bank transfers, there's no paper trail beyond the Havala bankers' notes themselves. And of course, they're working with criminals, they're part of the criminal infrastructure, they are not going to willingly give up that information. And that has existed for millennia, right? It's a traditional banking system, actually more traditional than the traditional ones in a way. And criminals still use that because it allows the untraceable and very quick transfer of wealth. Like, rather than going to a normal bank account and sending a wire transfer, which is trackable and can take days or hours or whatever, they can do this very, very quickly. And then when Havala bankers came onto Anom, they would even change their sort of profile photo or their username to say like ATM/Bitcoin with a little ATM emoji, that sort of thing. So they could broadcast and advertise their services. Anom became less of a messaging app and actually more of like a social network for criminals where you advertise all your various services. And then people can join in and message you if they want as well. But you're right in that. I mean, they've arrested some bankers. They arrested one guy in my book called Abdullah Aizuddin, who is pretty prolific and big. But you can't shut down the Havala banking system in general. And I think to be fair, there are legitimate parts of it as well. Like, there's nothing inherently criminal about that sort of system. It's just like a hell of a lot of people who are criminals use it, and also a lot of people providing that service are also criminals.
Right. So it's been a pretty thoroughly enjoyable conversation, and we've hit the 1 hour mark. So last two questions, and then we kind of exit this. First, again, from the sort of the framing of the way the book kind of ends, you have that one press conference and then all hell breaks loose. But there were certain countries that were missing from the action, because the UK, I mean, unless you're telling me that UK does not have a drug problem, was conspicuous by its absence. I mean, they were not really large party to it. Was it because of the 2016 madness of Brexit and the other things that were going on? And as a corollary and as an add-on to this, by 2021, the precedent had changed. So the person who had given permission had moved on. Was 2021 specifically targeted because the operation had to come to an end, or was it really it had reached its natural life?
Yeah, I'll keep it super brief. Anom phones did land in the UK. There were Anom phones there. I don't know how much it picked up there, in part because EncroChat was so popular in the UK that when EncroChat got hacked, it massively disrupted organized crime there. And I feel like they were still feeling sort of the fallout from there. As for why Anom eventually closed down, two reasons. The court order from Lithuania was allegedly, well, it was running out. They could have got another court order probably, but they decided to stop it there. And then I think the main reason they stopped is that, well, they always wanted it to move from a sort of intelligence operation to an evidence gathering one. Like they wanted to arrest people, so they had to do it at some point and had to come clean. But I think more importantly, Anom got too big. It was too successful. It was buckling under its own weight. More and more messages, 1 million messages a day near the end that all had to be read, all had to be analyzed for threats to life in case somebody got murdered on the app, because that already happened at least once earlier on. And it just wasn't sustainable anymore. Very much like a Silicon Valley tech company. It had hockey stick growth and it just became too successful.
Right. So, well, damned by its own its own success. The last question for you: there are multiple issues of technology riots and privacy that stem from this, but 2021 was 3 years ago. What has been happening in the world of encrypted chat apps? Where are we at?
Yeah. So after the Anom operation, I spoke to multiple people who sell these phones and drug traffickers, and they did tell me more people are moving to Signal. More people are using to Graphene OS, which is a security-focused operating system. They're taking Signal, installing it on Graphene, using it for a bit, throwing away the phone. They probably wouldn't have got arrested if they'd done that in the first place. Like they're learning. That brings up a key question: what happens now if more criminals move to the encrypted apps that we all use? And I don't think the FBI is just going to go home and say, oh, well, we're not going to investigate encrypted comms anymore. Something else is going to happen. I don't know what it is, but the FBI and other agencies do want to target other apps. I think it would be very crazy if they did do Signal specifically. No evidence that they have done that or that they necessarily going to act on it. But law enforcement isn't going to stop, is what I'm trying to say.
So, as I said, last question, but just this one question,
Sure.
And then we end.
Sure.
During all of this, and just after the Anom conversation came out in 2021, 2022, 2023, you have this massive malware information coming out of Israel. There is an application developed by the Israeli security services, most likely, available only to the government, that can get into anybody's app, that can get into anybody's phone. They don't even need a backdoor. They don't need to sell you a device. Do you think that is something that governments and law enforcement organizations would move on to?
I absolutely think more law enforcement agencies are going to turn to targeted hacking, including NSO Group's Pegasus that you're alluding to. Maybe not that specific tool, because NSO Group their tooling has been abused by many governments. They're losing customers. They were sanctioned by the US and sort of blocklisted there. But Western governments do use hacking tools. Asian governments do use hacking tools. Absolutely. We've seen plenty of evidence for that. And I think that if they can't get a backdoor or compromise an entire platform, police will move more towards targeted hacking. That could be done in a legal and ethical way. It could be done. There's also so much room for abuse that it's really case by case.
Right. So thank you very much. It's been an incredible conversation and incredible chatting with you. It's been an eye-opening conversation. The book, for everybody who's listening to it, is remarkable. We're going to put it out on YouTube, but also going to put out the description of the book and where they can get it in India. But the congratulations on the 1 year of the website, and we'll have you back soon.
Yes, please do. That was a really fun conversation. Thank you so much for the really sharp, engaged questions. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good one. Goodbye.
Thank you.